Section 7 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Chapter 4. The Journey from Samarkand to Kuldia. Part 1. On the morning of November the 16th we took a last look at the blue domes and minarets of Samarkand, intermingled with the ruins of palaces and tombs, and then wheeled away toward the banks of Zerafshan. Our 4 days' journey of 180 miles along the regular Russian post road was attended with only the usual vicissitudes of ordinary travel. Wading in our Russian top boots through the treacherous ford of the Snake Defile, we passed the pyramidal slate rock known as the Gate of Tamerlane, and emerged upon a strip of the Kizil Kum steppe, stretching hence in painful monotony to the bank of the Sirdarya river. This we crossed by a rude rope ferry, filled at the time with a passing caravan, and then began at once to ascend the valley of the Tchirtchik towards Tashkend. The blackened cotton which the natives were gathering from the fields, the lowering snow line on the mountains, the muddy roads, the chilling atmosphere, and the falling leaves of the giant poplars, all warned us of the approach of winter. We had hoped at least to reach Verneuil, a provincial capital near the converging point of the Turkestan, Siberian, and Chinese boundaries, whence we could continue, on the opening of the following spring, either through Siberia or across the Chinese Empire. But in this we were doomed to disappointment. The delay on the part of the Russian authorities in granting us permission to enter Transcaspia had postponed at least a month our arrival in Tashkend, and now, owing to the early advent of the rainy season, the roads leading north were almost impassable even for the native carts. This fact, together with the reports of heavy snowfalls beyond the Alexandrovsky Mountains on the road to Verneuil, lent a rather cogent influence to the persuasions of our friends to spend the winter among them. Then, too, such a plan, we thought, might not be unproductive of future advantages. Thus far we had been journeying through Russian territory without a passport. We had no authorization except the telegram to "come on," received from General Kuropatkine at Askabad, and the verbal permission of Count Rostozov at Samarkand to proceed to Tashkend. Furthermore, the passport for which we had just applied to Baron Revsky, the Governor General of Turkestan, would be available only as far as the border of Siberia, where we should have to apply to the various Governors General along our course to the Pacific, in case we should find the route across the Chinese Empire impracticable. A general permission to travel from Tashkend to the Pacific coast, through southern Siberia, could be obtained from St. Petersburg only, and that only through the chief executive of the province through which we were passing. Permission to enter Turkestan is by no means easily obtained, as is well understood by the student of Russian policy in Central Asia. We were not a little surprised, therefore, when our request to spend the winter in its capital was graciously granted by Baron Revsky, as well as the privilege for one of us to return in the meantime to London. This we had determined on, in order to secure some much-needed bicycle supplies, and to complete other arrangements for the success of our enterprise. By lot the return trip fell to Sachtleben. Proceeding by the Transcaspian and Transcaucasus railroads, the Caspian and Black Seas, to Constantinople, and thence by the overland express to Belgrade, Vienna, Frankfort, and Calais, he was able to reach London in 16 days. Tashkend, though nearly in the same latitude as New York, is so protected by the Alexandrovsky Mountains from the Siberian blizzards and the scorching winds of the Karakum Desert as to have an even more moderate climate. A tributary of the Tchirtchik River forms the line of demarcation between the native and the European portions of the city, although the population of the latter is by no means devoid of a native element. Both together cover an area as extensive as Paris, though the population is only 120,000, of which 100,000 are congregated in the native or Sart quarter. There is a floating element of Kashgarians, Bokhariots, Persians, and Afghans, and a resident majority of Kirghiz, Tartars, Jews, Hindus, Gypsies, and Sarts, the latter being a generic title for the urban as distinguished from the nomad people. Our winter quarters were obtained at the home of a typical Russian family, in company with a young reserve officer. He, having finished his university career and time of military service, was engaged in Tashkend in the interest of his father, a wholesale merchant in Moscow. With him we were able to converse either in French or German, both of which languages he could speak more purely than his native Russian. Our good-natured, corpulent host had emigrated, in the pioneer days, from the steppe of southern Russia, and had grown wealthy through the unearned increment. The Russian samovar is the characteristic feature of the Russian household. Besides a big bowl of cabbage soup at every meal, our Russian host would start in with a half tumbler of vodka, dispose of a bottle of beer in the intervals, and then top off with 2 or 3 glasses of tea. The mistress of the household, being limited in her beverages to tea and soup, would usually make up in quantity what was lacking in variety. In fact, one day she informed us that she had not imbibed a drop of water for over 6 years. For this, however, there is a very plausible excuse. With the water at Tashkend, as with that from the Zerafshan at Bokhara, a dangerous worm called reshta is absorbed into the system. Nowhere have we drunk better tea than around the steaming samovar of our Tashkend host. No peasant is too poor, either in money or in sentiment, to buy and feel the cheering influence of tea. Even the Cossack, in his forays into the wilds of Central Asia, is sustained by it. Unlike the Chinese, the Russians consider sugar a necessary concomitant of tea drinking. There are 3 methods of sweetening tea: to put the sugar in the glass, to place a lump of sugar in the mouth and suck the tea through it, to hang a lump in the midst of a tea-drinking circle to be swung around for each in turn to touch with his tongue, and then to take a swallow of tea. The meaning of the name Tashkend is City of Stone, but a majority of the houses are 1-story mud structures, built low so as to prevent any disastrous effects from earthquakes. The roofs are so flat and poorly constructed that during the rainy season a dry ceiling is rather the exception than the rule. Every building is covered with whitewash or white paint, and fronts directly on the street. There are plenty of back and side yards, but none in the front. This is not so bad on the broad streets of a Russian town. In Tashkend they are exceptionally wide, with ditches on each side through which the water from the Tchurchik ripples along beneath the double, and even quadruple, rows of poplars, acacias, and willows. These trees grow here with remarkable luxuriance, from a mere twig stuck into the ground. Although 20 years of Russian irrigation has given nature a chance to rear thousands of trees on former barren wastes, yet wood is still comparatively scarce and dear. The administration buildings of the city are for the most part exceedingly plain and unpretentious. In striking contrast is the new Russian cathedral, the recently erected school, and a large retail store built by a resident Greek, all of which are fine specimens of Russian architecture. Among its institutions are an observatory, a museum containing an embryo collection of Turkestan products and antiquities, and a medical dispensary for the natives, where vaccination is performed by graduates of medicine in the Tashkend school. The rather extensive library was originally collected for the chancellery of the Governor General, and contains the best collection of works on Central Asia that is to be found in the world, including in its scope not only books and pamphlets, but even magazines and newspaper articles. For amusements, the city has a theatre, a small imitation of the opera house at Paris, and the military club, which, with its billiards and gambling, and weekly reunions, balls, and concerts, though a regular feature of a Russian garrison town, is especially pretentious in Tashkend. In size, architecture, and appointments, the club house has no equal, we were told, outside the capital and Moscow. Tashkend has long been known as a refuge for damaged reputations and shattered fortunes, or the official purgatory following upon the Emperor's displeasure. One of the finest houses of the city is occupied by the Grand Duke Nikolai Konstantinovich Romanoff, son of the late General Admiral of the Russian Navy, and first cousin to the Tsar, who seems to be cheerfully resigned to his life in exile. Most of his time is occupied with the business of his silk factory on the outskirts of Tashkend, and at his farm near Hojent, which a certain firm in Chicago, at the time of our sojourn, was stocking with irrigating machinery. All of his bills are paid with checks drawn on his St. Petersburg trustees. His private life is rather unconventional, and even democratic. Visitors to his household are particularly impressed with the beauty of his wife and the size of his liquor glasses. The example of the Grand Duke illustrates the sentiment in favor of industrial pursuits which is growing among the military classes, and even among the nobility of Russia. The government itself, thanks to the severe lesson of the Crimean War, has learned that a great nation must stand upon a foundation of something more than aristocracy and nobility. To this influence is largely due the present growing prosperity of Tashkend, which, in military importance, is rapidly giving way to Askabad, the key to Herat. The spirit of equality and fraternity which characterizes the government of a Russian mir, or village, has been carried even into Central Asia. We have frequently seen Russian peasants and natives occupying adjoining apartments in the same household, while in the process of trade all classes seem to fraternize in an easy and even cordial manner. The same is true of the children, who play together indiscriminately in the street. Many a one of these heterogeneous groups we have watched playing marbles with the ankle bones of sheep, and listened with some amusement to their half Russian, half native jargon. Schools are now being established to educate the native children in the Russian language and methods, and native apprentices are being taken in by Russian merchants for the same purpose. In Tashkend, as in every European city of the Orient, drunkenness and gambling and social laxity have followed upon the introduction of Western morals and culture. Jealousy and intrigue among the officers and functionaries are also not strange, perhaps at so great a distance from headquarters, where the only avenue to distinction seems to lie through the public service. At the various dinner parties and sociables given throughout the winter, the topic of war always met with general welcome. On one occasion a report was circulated that Abdurrahman Khan, the Emir of Afghanistan, was lying at the point of death. Great preparations, it was said, were being made for an expedition over the Pamir, to establish on the throne the Russian candidate, Is-Shah Khan, from Samarkand, before Ayub Khan, the rival British protégé, could be brought from India. The young officers at once began to discuss their chances for promotion, and the number of decorations to be forthcoming from St. Petersburg. The social gatherings at Tashkend were more convivial than sociable. Acquaintances can eat and drink together with the greatest of good cheer, but there is very little sympathy in conversation. It was difficult for them to understand why we had come so far to see a country which to many of them was a place of exile. An early spring morning did not mean an early departure from winter quarters. Impassable roads kept us anxious prisoners for a month and a half after the necessary papers had been secured. These included, in addition to the local passports, a carte blanche permission to travel from Tashkend to Vladivostok, through Turkestan and Siberia, a document obtained from St. Petersburg through the United States Minister, the Honorable Charles Emery Smith. Of this route to the Pacific we were therefore certain, and yet, despite the universal opinion that a bicycle journey across the Celestial Empire was impracticable, we had determined to continue on to the border line, and there to seek better information. "Don't go into China," were the last words of our many kind friends as we wheeled out of Tashkend on the 7th of May. At Chimkend our course turned abruptly from what was once the main route between Russia's European and Asiatic capitals, and along which de Lesseps, in his letter to the Tsar, proposed a line of railroad to connect Orenburg with Samarkand, a distance about equal to that between St. Petersburg and Odessa, 1,483 miles. This is also the keystone in that wall of forts which Russia gradually raised around her unruly nomads of the steppes, and where, according to Gortchakov's circular of 1864, both interest and reason required her to stop. And yet at that very time General Chernayeff was advancing his forces upon the present capital, Tashkend. Here too we began that journey of 1,500 miles along the celestial mountain range, which terminated only when we scaled its summit beyond Barkul, and descend again into the burning sands of the desert of Gobi. Here runs the great historical highway between China and the West. From Ali Eta eastward we had before us about 200 miles of vast steppe region. Near the mountains is a wilderness of lakes, swamps, and streams which run dry in summer. This is the country of the thousand springs mentioned by the Chinese pilgrim Huen Tsang, and where was established the kingdom of Black China, supposed by many to have been one of the kingdoms of Prester John. But far away to our left were the white sands of the Ak-Kum, over which the cloudless atmosphere quivers incessantly, like the blasts of a furnace. Of all these deserts, occupying probably one half of the whole Turkestan steppe, none is more terrible than that of the Golodnaya steppe, or steppe of hunger, to the north of the white sands, now before us. Even in the cool of evening it is said that the soles of the wayfarer's feet become scorched, and the dog accompanying him finds no repose till he has burrowed below the burning surface. The monotonous appearance of the steppe itself is only intensified in winter, when the snow smooths over the broken surface, and even necessitates the placing of mud posts at regular intervals to mark the roadway for the Kirghiz post drivers. But in the spring and autumn its arid surface is clothed, as if by enchantment, with verdure and prairie flowers. Both flowers and birds are gorgeously colored. One variety, about half the size of the jackdaw which infests the houses of Tashkend and Samarkand, has a bright blue body and red wings. Another, resembling our field lark in size and habits, combines a pink breast with black head and wings. But already this springtide splendor was beginning to disappear beneath the glare of approaching summer. The long wagon trains of lumber and the occasional traveler's tarantass rumbling along to the discord of its duga bells were enveloped in a cloud of suffocating dust. Now and then we would overtake a party of Russian peasants migrating from the famine-stricken districts of European Russia to the pioneer colonies along this Turkestan highway. The peculiarity of these villages is their extreme length, all the houses facing on the one wide street. Most of them are merely mud huts, others make pretensions to doors and windows and a coat of whitewash. Near by usually stands the old battered telega, which served as a home during many months of travel over the Orenburg highway. It speaks well for the colonizing capacity of the Russians that they can be induced to come so many hundreds of miles from their native land to settle in such a primitive way among the half-wild tribes of the steppes. As yet they do very little farming, but live, like the Kirghiz, by raising horses, cows, sheep, and goats, and in addition the Russian hog, the last resembling very much the wild swine of the jungles. Instead of the former military colonies of plundering Cossacks, who really become more assimilated to the Kirghiz than these to their conquerors, the mir, or communal system, is now penetrating these fertile districts, and systematically replacing the Mongolian culture. But the ignorance of this lower class of Russians is almost as noticeable as that of the natives themselves. As soon as we entered a village, the blacksmith left his anvil, the carpenter his bench, the storekeeper his counter, and the milkmaid her task. After our parade of the principal street, the crowd would gather round us at the station house. All sorts of queries and ejaculations would pass among them. One would ask, "Are these gentlemen baptized? Are they really Christians?" On account of their extreme ignorance, these Russian colonists are by no means able to cope with their German colleagues, who are given the poorest land and yet make a better living. The steppe is a good place for learning patience. With the absence of landmarks you seem never to be getting anywhere. It presents the appearance of a boundless level expanse, the very undulations of which are so uniform as to conceal the intervening troughs. Into these horsemen, and sometimes whole caravans, mysteriously disappear. In this way we were often enabled to surprise a herd of gazelles grazing by the roadside. They would stand for a moment with necks extended, and then scamper away like a shot, springing on their pipe–stem limbs 3 or 4 feet into the air. Our average rate was about 7 miles an hour, although the roads were sometimes so soft with dust or sand as to necessitate the laying of straw for a foundation. There was scarcely an hour in the day when we were not accompanied by from 1 to 20 Kirghiz horsemen, galloping behind us with cries of "Yakshi" (good). They were especially curious to see how we crossed the roadside streams. Standing on the bank, they would watch intently every move as we stripped and waded through with bicycles and clothing on our shoulders. Then they would challenge us to a race, and if the road permitted, we would endeavour to reveal some of the possibilities of the devil's carts. On an occasion like this occurred one of our few mishaps. The road was lined by the occupants of a neighbouring tent village, who had run out to see the race. One of the Kirghiz turned suddenly back in the opposite direction from which he had started. The wheel struck him at a rate of 15 miles per hour, lifting him off his feet, and hurling over the handle–bars the rider, who fell upon his left arm and twisted it out of place. With the assistance of the bystanders it was pulled back into the socket, and bandaged up till we reached the nearest Russian village. Here the only physician was an old blind woman of the faith–cure persuasion. Her massage treatment to replace the muscles was really effective, and was accompanied by prayers and by signs of the cross, a common method of treatment among the lower class of Russians. In one instance a cure was supposed to be effected by writing a prayer on a piece of buttered bread, to be eaten by the patient. Being users, but not patrons, of the Russian post–roads, we were not legally entitled to the conveniences of the post–stations. Tipping alone, as we found on our journey from Samarkand, was not always sufficient to preclude a request during the night to vacate the best quarters for the post–traveller, especially if he happened to wear the regulation brass button. To secure us against this inconvenience, and to gain some special attention, a letter was obtained from the overseer of the Turkestan post and telegraph district. This proved advantageous on many occasions, and once, at Alyouita, was even necessary. We were surveyed with suspicious glances as soon as we entered the station–house, and when we asked for water to lave our hands and face, we were directed to the irrigating ditch in the street. Our request for a better room was answered by the question, if the one we had was not good enough, and how long we intended to occupy that. Evidently our English conversation had gained for us the covert reputation of being English spies, and this was verified in the minds of our hosts when we began to ask questions about the city prisons we had passed on our way. To every interrogation they replied, "I don't know," but presto, change on the presentation of documents. Apologies were now profuse, and besides tea, bread, and eggs, the usual rations of a Russian post–station, we were exceptionally favoured with chicken soup and verandik, the latter consisting of cheese, wrapped and boiled in dough, and then served in butter. It has been the custom for travellers in Russia to decry the Russian post–station, but the fact is that an appreciation of this rather primitive form of accommodation depends entirely upon whether you approach it from a European hotel or from a Persian khan. Some are clean, while others are dirty. Nevertheless, it was always a welcome sight to see a small white building looming up in the dim horizon at the close of a long day's ride, and, on near approach, to observe the black and white striped post in front, and idle tarantasses around it. At the door would be found the usual crowd of Kirghiz post–drivers. After the presentation of documents to the starosta, who would hesitate at first about quartering our horses in the travellers' room, we would proceed at once to place our dust–covered heads beneath the spindle of the washing–tank. Although by this dripping–pan arrangement we would usually succeed in getting as much water down our backs as on our faces, yet we were consoled by the thought that too much was better than not enough, as had been the case in Turkey and Persia. Then we would settle down before the steaming samovar to meditate in solitude and quiet, while the rays of the declining sun shone on the gilded ikon in the corner of the room, and on the chromo covered walls. When darkness fell, and the simmering music of the samovar had gradually died away, when the flitting swallows in the room had ceased their chirp and settled down upon the rafters overhead, we ourselves would turn in under our fur–lined coats upon the leather–covered benches. Section 8